When I was 14 years old, my family and I went camping in a state park. My friend and I were excited to spend our days exploring the woods and our nights telling scary stories around the campfire. We drove from our suburban neighborhood in New Jersey to Herman State Park in New York, only a few hours away. My parents loved the outdoors and had always wanted to show me the beauty of the Hudson Valley region. The park was vast, covering miles of thick forest, rolling hills, and secluded lakes. I remember being enchanted by the tall oaks and maples towering overhead, their leaves forming a canopy that let only faint rays of sunlight break through. My friend Thomas was just as excited as I was, maybe even more. We'd been talking about the trip for weeks, planning which trails we'd hike and what kind of spooky stories we could tell each other. After dark on the first day, we set up our tents at one of the designated camping spots near Lake Tiara. My parents parked our car alongside a few other fams' vehicles. The campground was busy with people carrying coolers, rolling up sleeping bags, and chatting around picnic tables. We spent the afternoon swimming in the lake and then returned to our campsite to roast hot dogs and marshmallows. That night, as the stars emerged over the silhouettes of the trees, Thomas and I exchanged ghost stories we'd heard at school, trying to outdo each other with creepy details. We ended up scaring ourselves more than anyone else, but at the time it was just harmless fun. The next evening, after a family hike along the Pine Meadow Trail, Thomas and I decided to take what we called the walk. We loved venturing deeper into the woods when the night sky was clear. Using our flashlights to guide us, we were certain we knew the trails well enough, and we felt a surge of excitement at the prospect of exploring without adults hovering over us. We veered off the main path, joking about the stories we'd told by the fire, never suspecting we might stumble upon something far less supernatural, but infinitely more disturbing. As we walked, the forest around us seemed to stretch into a labyrinth of darkened paths. Crickets chirped, and occasionally we heard the hoot of an owl. At first we shrugged off the faint crunch of leaves or the snapping of a twig. Wildlife was common here, but then we heard something else, a low mumbling barely audible over the rustling leaves. Thomas and I paused, shining our flashlights into the dense undergrowth. We saw nothing but tree trunks and bushes. We laughed nervously, deciding it was probably another camper just a bit farther down the trail. We continued, but the sounds persisted, becoming more distinct, a whispered voice carrying through the still air. My pulse quickened, yet neither of us was ready to admit we were scared. Suddenly our flashlights caught movement ahead. A woman was on all fours, crawling across the music path. She wore dark clothing, and her hair was matted, making it hard to see her face. She was muttering words we couldn't quite understand, like she was disoriented. Our first instinct was to call out, but our voices caught in our throats from shock. Then, as if sensing our presence, she turned her head toward us. We hurried over, asking if she was hurt. She paused, got to her feet unsteadily, and kept mumbling that she was looking for her campsite. The slur in her speech was unmistakable. She could have been intoxicated or maybe suffering from dehydration. We didn't know what to do other than offer to help. Thomas and I each took an arm, guiding her along the main trail until we reached an area with a few tents. Her gear was scattered, her tent partially collapsed, and no one else seemed to be around. She mentioned something about her friends, but it came out jumbled. Worried, we gave her some water and helped her lie down, then hurried back to our campsite. The next day, we spotted her near a picnic table by the lake. She was sitting still, staring at the water, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. When we waved hesitantly, she barely acknowledged us. My parents, noticing our concern, asked if we were okay. We avoided telling them the full story, only mentioning we'd come across a drunk camper. Despite a lingering sense of unease, we hoped that was the end of it. That evening, my dad decided to drive into the nearby town of Schlossberg to pick up some extra supplies. He asked if Thomas and I wanted to join, but we declined. We were restless and still curious, so we convinced ourselves to go on another walk, just a short one, before dark. As we set out, we half expected to hear those strange whispers again, but the forest seemed calm. We joked that maybe we were both spooked the night before and let our imaginations run wild. But as we ventured a little deeper, we heard muffled sounds. We switched off our flashlights for a moment, trying to identify where the noise was coming from. We realized it was the same woman standing near a tree, her posture tense. She was talking, but we couldn't see anyone else around. At first we thought she was on her phone, but there was no phone light. When she noticed us, she stopped abruptly. Something about her expression, wide-eyed like a cornered animal, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Thomas tugged on my sleeve, signaling we should back away, and I agreed. We quickly turned around, heading back to camp. Without a word, we tried to sleep that night, but both of us woke around midnight When we heard someone rummaging near our tents, my parents were still asleep, oblivious to the noise. Fear gripped me. It could have been a raccoon or a deer, but the thought of that strange woman made it impossible to stay calm. I forced myself to peek outside, but by then whoever or whatever had made the noise was gone. At dawn, Thomas and I packed our bags without delay. I told my parents we felt uneasy about staying another night. They must have sensed our genuine fear, because despite having planned a longer stay, they agreed to head home early. We loaded our gear, and as we pulled away from the site, I caught one last glimpse of that woman standing by the ranger's station. She looked exhausted, her eyes hollow. Part of me wanted to roll down the window and ask if she was okay, but I couldn't find the courage. A moment later, she was out of sight as we rounded a bend in the road. I never learned her name, nor did I find out what truly happened that night. Maybe she was just lost or under the influence. Perhaps she fought with her friends, or maybe something worse was going on, but the memory of her haunted look and incoherent mumbling stayed with me, reminding me that real encounters in the woods can be more unsettling than any campfire ghost story. Before we dive into the next story, if you're visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to stay updated with our upcoming scary stories. When my wife and I got married last spring, we decided to spend part of our honeymoon camping in Northern California. We lived in the Bay Area at the time, and Redwood National and State Parks were about a 5-hour drive north, close enough for a road trip, but far enough to feel like a real getaway. A severe storm had blown through the region a day before, knocking over tree branches and causing flash flood warnings, but we figured the worst of it had passed. We were excited about having the place almost to ourselves. We set out early in the morning, our car loaded with a brand new tent, a cooler full of food, and the kind of optimism only newlyweds can have. The drive up US 101 was beautiful. Once the clouds broke, we stopped briefly in Eureka for supplies, extra water, a small bundle of firewood, then continued to the campground. When we arrived, the park's entrance station was eerily quiet. A lone ranger emerged from a small wooden booth to greet us. "Not too many campers this weekend," he said with a shrug. "You two might have the whole area to yourselves." We exchanged excited glances, thinking this would be the perfect adventure. We obtained our permit and followed the winding road deeper into the forest. Towering redwoods loomed on either side, and the late afternoon sun filtered in through the thick canopy, creating patterns of light and shadow on the road. Before long, the pavement turned to a narrow gravel path, barely wide enough for one car. It felt like we were being swallowed by the forest itself. Eventually, we reached the designated site. It was just a small clearing surrounded by giant trees, with a fire ring and a modest picnic table. The ranger hadn't been kidding. No one else was around. My wife grinned, calling it romantic. I agreed, despite the isolation, or maybe because of it, the atmosphere felt special. We got out and surveyed our spot. One detail that stood out was how silent everything seemed. Usually forests are full of rustling, chirping, and distant animal calls. Here, though, it felt muted, as if even nature was catching its breath. After the storm, we shrugged it off, set up our tent, and organized our gear. Since we still had daylight to spare, we decided to walk a bit further along the trail we'd come in on, just to see if we could reach any lookouts or interesting landmarks. We strolled together beneath the redwoods, marveling at their size. Every so often we spotted fallen branches or waterlogged underbrush, remnants of the storm. After about half a mile, we stumbled on a cluster of small, rundown cabins. They looked like they hadn't been used in ages. Gray paint peeling off the walls, broken windows, and doors that hung crooked on their hinges. We guessed these structures might have been old ranger stations, or maybe part of a closed-off campground section. The place gave off a strange vibe, so we decided not to linger. Back at our site, we tried to start a fire for dinner. The ranger's firewood bundle helped, but almost everything else around us was still damp. I tried gathering small twigs for kindling, but most were too soggy to catch. Eventually, we managed to light one of those store-bought fire logs and coax a weak flame to life. We roasted hot dogs on skewers and toasted marshmallows for dessert, laughing at our amateurish attempts at outdoorsy cooking. When the last bit of sun vanished behind the tallest redwoods, the darkness was absolute. My wife commented that we'd never seen a sky so black. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and only a few stars pierced the canopy overhead. It was a sharp contrast to city life, where street lights and buildings always provide some sense of orientation. We settled on the picnic table for a while, listening intently for any nightlife sounds. The hush around us was as thick as the darkness. After an hour or so, my wife admitted she was getting nervous. "Can we call it a night and get in the tent?" she asked. I agreed. We doused the fire making sure it was fully out, then crawled into our tent. We zipped ourselves into our sleeping bags, still chatting quietly about the day's drive, our wedding memories, and the plans we had for the rest of our honeymoon. Maybe half an hour passed before my wife went rigid. She whispered, pressing a finger against my lips. I froze, straining my ears. At first, I heard nothing, just my breath. Then came the distinct sound of footsteps on wet leaves, not one or two, but multiple, as if several people were moving around outside. My mind raced. We were in the middle of nowhere. Who else could be out there? My wife gave me a wide-eyed look, silently asking if I could explain it. I mouthed the word animals. But at that moment we heard a low mumbling noise, like voices whispering. It wasn't the sound of wildlife. The footsteps seemed to circle our campsite, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. The murmurs grew clearer, but never rose above a whisper, so we couldn't make out actual words. I felt my heart pounding in my chest. My wife's hand was clammy in mine, and neither of us wanted to move or make a sound. The footsteps drew closer until it seemed they were right by the tent. The fabric shifted slightly as someone brushed against it. We were both holding our breath, terrified to draw attention. Then just as suddenly, the noise stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices. We waited in tense silence for what felt like hours. Finally, my wife and I exchanged a look that said, "We can't stay here." Summoning courage, I wasn't sure I had. I unzipped the tent and peeked outside. Nothing, everything was still. I gestured for her to follow me quickly to the car. We sprinted across the clearing, and I immediately locked the doors. Once we were inside, adrenaline coursed through me as I said, "Stay here, I'll grab the gear." I hopped out, feeling the hairs on my neck stand up. The night was black, and the trees stood like silent sentinels. I grabbed our cooler and tossed it in the back seat, but the moment I turned toward the tent, I heard another twig snap, closer than before. Panic surged. I yanked the tent stakes out of the ground, wrapping everything in a messy bundle, and flung it into the trunk. Back in the driver's seat, I revved the engine and reversed out of the sight. When we reached an unmarked junction, I realized we'd gotten turned around. My wife frantically scanned for any sign that pointed to the park entrance. Finally, I spotted a small arrow sign partially hidden by dense ferns. We took that route, speeding through the winding roads until we reached the main gate. Off to the side, I caught a fleeting glimpse of a single glowing light amidst the trees, like someone's headlamp or flashlight. We didn't stop. We drove the entire 5 hours back home in near silence, arriving at her parents' place close to dawn. Exhausted, we collapsed on the living room couch. Neither of us said much about what happened. We never brought it up again, and we haven't gone camping since. My name is Daniel Everett. About 3 years ago, I found myself unemployed and under immense pressure from my parents, who questioned every decision I made. I needed a break from them, from the endless job applications, and from the suffocating feeling that my life was spinning out of control. Camping alone seemed like a good idea, a way to clear my head and reset. So I chose to drive to Pisa National Forest in North Carolina. The spot I picked was not an official campground, but rather a small clearing near a creek a few miles from a visitor center. I arrived on a Wednesday, thinking I would avoid weekend crowds. The drive itself was uneventful, though I felt an undercurrent of anxiety pulsing through me. Upon arrival, I parked in a narrow pull-off, hoisted my worn backpack, and treated about 15 minutes down a modest trail to the site. I spent my first afternoon settling in. I pitched my tent under a tall canopy of hardwoods and sycamores. The forest floor was damp from recent rain, and a light breeze rustled the leaves overhead. I tried to relax, but felt restless, so I unpacked my folding chair and sat by the creek. The sound of running water usually calms me, but that day I found my thoughts drifting anxiously to my financial situation and the nagging guilt of leaving home without a definite plan. By dusk, the woods grew darker than I had anticipated. In my determination to be self-sufficient, I had only a small flashlight, but it sufficed to help me gather some firewood. The logs were still somewhat damp, but with persistence and a few fire starters, I managed to get a modest flame going. I roasted a couple of hot dogs, ate quietly, and watched the glow of the fire dance on the surrounding trees. That first night was calm, though I barely slept. Instead, I stayed awake, listening to every nocturnal sound. The wind in the branches and the trickle of the creek were oddly hypnotic. I told myself it was just first night nerves. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off, only to wake up at dawn in a cold sweat. My mind refused to let go of the sense that I was still being judged or watched. The next day, I explored a nearby trail aside from a few distant birds and one fleeting glimpse of a deer. The forest seemed empty. Back at my campsite in the late afternoon, I noticed something unsettling, a shallow footprint near the edge of my clearing, half obscured by leaves. It could have been from a hiker or even my shoe, yet comparing the tread I realized it did not match mine. My heartbeat quickened, but I tried to stay logical. This was a popular region. Maybe someone passed by and I just did not notice. Later I started up another fire, a bit larger this time. The woods grew cool in the evening, and the crackling flames felt comforting. Night descended more rapidly, and I realized my flashlight was dimming. I reminded myself to change the batteries in the morning. That night, I fell asleep to the same forest sounds as before, only to jolt awake around midnight. When I thought I heard leaves crunching, I held my breath, straining my ears. Silence, perhaps an animal, crossed close by. For a few tense minutes I remained perfectly still, my fingers gripping the edge of my sleeping bag. My mind raced with possibilities, from bears to bobcats to human trespassers. Eventually, I heard nothing else and let out a shaky exhale, falling back into an uneasy sleep. The following morning, I felt a tension in my gut. I thought about heading home, but decided to stick it out for at least one more night. After breakfast, I examined the area around my tent. I found no new footprints, but the dew on some leaves appeared disturbed. My imagination was probably getting the better of me. Around midday, I took a short drive to a local convenience store near the Forest Service Road. I refilled my water jug, bought fresh batteries, and asked the cashier if anyone had reported unusual activity. She just shook her head and told me it was typically slow this time of year. Feeling a bit reassured, I drove back, resolved to enjoy the final night of my camping trip. That evening I made a more substantial dinner of instant noodles and canned beans. The forest was quiet, with only the occasional rustle in the underbrush. After cleaning up, I read by lantern light, determined to remain calm. Hours passed, and I finally crawled into my tent, zipping up the flap securely. Somewhere in the middle of the night, the crunching of leaves returned. This time, it sounded closer and more deliberate. I lay still, heart pounding. My mind spun with thoughts of trespassers or thieves. Summoning courage, I slowly sat up and unzipped my tent. A few inches darkness pressed against the opening, then a beam of light flickered like a quick, narrow flash from a headlamp. It vanished almost immediately, but I had seen it clearly. Someone was out there, moving around. I debated shouting or making my presence known, but fear held me silent. I listened as the footsteps circled the perimeter of my campsite. They stopped near my car and then seemed to retreat into the woods. I waited, counting the seconds. Minutes passed, stretching into eternity. Eventually, I risked crawling out. My hands trembled as I scanned the clearing with my dim flashlight. No one was visible, but the forest felt charged with tension. Gathering my gear at first light, I wasted no time, packing everything into my trunk. Before leaving, I noticed scuff marks on the ground near my car's passenger side. They led into the woods beyond the boundary of my makeshift camp. With every nerve on edge, I climbed into the driver's seat and sped away, unable to shake the dread that someone had watched me all night. In the rearview mirror, the towering trees seemed to loom with silent judgment. I realized then that, jobless or not, I had more pressing concerns than my family's criticism. At least in my parents' home, the worst threat to my safety was an argument. Out here on my own, I might have encountered a stranger who preferred not to be found. That thought settled over me like a dark cloud. Only when I reached the highway did I finally exhale, my mind spinning with the question, what would have happened if I had stayed one more night.